They gave it to her the morning after her mother's funeral. The smell of ashes still clung to the walls, and the oil lamp burned low, as if even the fire had begun to mourn. Adiz sat on the cool floor with bare knees and swollen eyes when her stepmother approached, carrying something in her hands. It was not a blanket, not a wrapper, not a dress. It was barely a cloth, thin like worn-out gauze, the color of old rain. It looked like it had once belonged to a rag pile and had somehow escaped its fate, only to find a worse one in her arms. "This is yours now," the woman said, her mouth tight with something close to triumph. Adiz reached out slowly. She was 10, and the world had gone quiet since her mother's last breath. She thought maybe this was the beginning of something new, something kind. The cloth was placed in her lap with a slap instead of a gesture. "Don't tear it," her stepmother warned, "or you'll bleed." The words didn't make sense to Adiz then. She thought it was a proverb, a threat wrapped in poetry. She would come to understand it better, painfully, literally, over time. That day she wrapped the cloth around herself, holding it closed with one hand as she walked. It barely reached her knees. One tug of wind and her shoulders would be bare. There was no tie, no second layer, no forgiveness. And no one offered her anything else. Her uncle averted his eyes. Her stepbrother laughed. Her cousins made a game of pretending not to see her shiver. "This is your skin now," her stepmother said one evening. "Treat it well, or it will tear you back." In the first month, it tore slightly under her left armpit. A branch had snagged it while she was fetching firewood. It was hardly noticeable. But that night, the stepmother lifted her sleeve with exaggerated patience, found the rip, and nodded solemnly. Adiz was dragged behind the house, her cries swallowed by the wind. The beatings didn't come as rage. They were calm, practiced. Each blow landed as if it had been measured. "This is not punishment," the woman said as Adiz wept into the dirt. "This is memory. Let your skin remember what your fingers did." After that, Adiz walked carefully, sat carefully, slept like a statue. She taught herself to move in folds, to never stretch, to never twist too quickly. She never played. Never danced when the other children did. The cloth had rules, and the rules lived inside her. But even when careful, cloth ages. It began to wear thin where her thighs rubbed as she walked. It faded further from too many washes in cold water. The edges curled, then frayed. She tried sewing it with dried thread once, a careful stitch hidden underneath. Her stepmother noticed. "You think hiding it changes what's broken?" Another round of blows. This time across her back. Adiz didn't cry out. She knew silence was safer. In the second year, the cloth developed a hole just beneath her collarbone, a tiny thing shaped like an eye. She used her hair to cover it. Braided carefully every morning, pulling strands forward until her neck was no longer visible. For weeks it worked. But cloth thins with secrets too. Eventually, her stepbrother tugged on a braid one afternoon and exposed the hole. He pointed, laughed, called her Threadbone. The name stuck. When her stepmother saw the damage, she sighed like she was tired of disappointment. "You tore your honor again." That night, the beating came with cold water. She was stripped of the cloth, left naked in the dark for hours, then told to wear it again by dawn. Wet, heavy, cold. She shivered through the sunrise, feeling each thread stick to her skin. By age 12, she had learned to walk without moving. Her feet barely left the ground. Her hands always hovered near her waist, holding the edges closed. Even in sleep, she clutched it like a second spine. They told her the cloth was a lesson. That girls who needed more than one thing to wear were greedy. That beauty lived in endurance. That covering her shame with shame would teach her how to be good. The cloth said, "Be still." The cloth said, "Don't grow." But Adiz was growing. Her bones stretched despite her stillness. Her arms grew longer. Her chest began to shift. The cloth, once barely enough, now became impossible. When she bent, it lifted. When she ran, it flapped. When she slept, it slipped. And the beatings got worse. Every rip, every stretch, every visible sign of her changing body was treated like betrayal. "Keep it intact," her stepmother said, "or we'll sew your skin instead." By 13, Adiz had scars on her back, her thighs, the tops of her arms. Tiny raised lines, not always from the beatings but from where the cloth had rubbed too long in the heat. The fabric had become like paper. One wrong move and it tore. Once she tried folding a leaf into the hem for strength. Just a small one. She thought it might help. The woman smelled it instantly. Nature won't save you. This time she was beaten with the folded leaf still inside the cloth. Her skin broke in patterns, crisscrossed and green-stained. But it wasn't only the pain that changed her. It was the way the cloth started whispering. Not with words but with feeling. She would wake at night and feel it shift on her like it had grown a memory. When she touched the tear near her hip, it felt hot, like a warning. When she looked at her reflection in the water basin, the cloth seemed to blur before her eyes, as if ashamed of what it had become. At 14 she stopped calling it cloth. She started calling it the curse. But she still wore it, because to not wear it would mean shame. And beatings. And perhaps worse. So she wrapped it every morning. Bound herself with silence. Folded her future into tight corners. But something had started to grow beneath the fabric. Not just her skin. Not just her body. Something harder. Something that didn't fray. She couldn't name it yet. But she could feel it, a pressure beneath the ribs. A burning when she heard the word thread bone. A tightening in her chest when the cloth was yanked or inspected or blamed. And one morning as she folded the cloth with shaking fingers, she noticed that it had torn again. A long thin rip down the center. Right over her stomach. Too large to hide. She stared at it for a long time. Her stepmother called from the other room. Adiz didn't answer. She folded the cloth once more, carefully, gently, and this time she didn't put it on. She tied it instead to the wooden beam above her sleeping mat like a banner. And then she sat, naked but unshivering as the sun crept through the cracks in the roof. For the first time she let the light touch all of her. She heard the woman's footsteps. Heard her voice growing angry. You tore it again? Adiz didn't speak. She didn't run. She didn't cry. She simply stared at the cloth. And whispered, more to herself than to anyone, let it tear. I'm still here. It was the kind of night that held its breath before breaking. The sky had turned a strange green-gray before sundown, and the wind came not in gusts, but in slow whistling circles that wound their way through the trees and compound walls like something searching for a name. Adiz was sent out to gather dry sticks, though even a fool could see the rain was coming. She didn't argue. She never did. The cloth barely clung to her that evening. The wind lifted it around her knees and shoulders, dragging it like a reluctant flag. She held it tight with one hand as she moved through the trees near the back edge of the compound. There were no paths here, just space between roots, quiet and uneasy. When the storm cracked open, it wasn't with a shout but a hiss. The first drop hit her shoulder. Then another. Then suddenly a sheet of rain, heavy and warm. She ducked under the nearest tree, heart racing, sticks forgotten. The branch was low. She crouched fast to avoid it, but the wind had its own mischief. As she slipped sideways, the branch caught the back of her cloth, just near the bottom hem, and snagged. She heard it before she felt it. A soft, unnatural sound like something sighing in pain. The cloth tugged against her back and then there was a gentle "arr", a noise so soft it almost didn't matter. But Adiz knew. She stood still for several heartbeats, rain pounding against her scalp and neck, letting it soak in. Her hand moved slowly to the place where the cloth had resisted, and her fingers met the rip, small, maybe 4 fingers wide, but clean. It hadn't split from where. It had torn from carelessness. From her. She felt dizzy. Not from the cold or the rain or the fear. But from the sudden knowledge that this wasn't just a rip in fabric. It was a prophecy fulfilled. A line crossed. A sentence rewritten. The wind laughed behind her as she ran home. By the time she reached the compound, her cloth was soaked and clinging to her like second skin. Her knees were muddy. Her breath came in gasps. She tried to fold the cloth strategically, to hide the rip in a pleat. She pressed it flat with her hands, wrapped the loose end around her waist an extra time, hoping the wetness would keep it in place. Her stepmother was already outside, standing near the fire like she'd been waiting. Adiz slowed her steps. Tried not to look guilty. Tried not to shake. But cloth has memory. And the tear revealed itself anyway with the shifting of a breeze, a flash of lightning, a breath too deep. There, the woman said, voice cold. What is that? Adiz's fingers flew to cover it, but the damage was done. I asked a question. It caught on a... You tore it. No, You tore it. The broomstick was already in her hand. The first lash came without warning. Across the back. The second struck lower, wrapping around her hip. Adiz cried out, not from the pain, but from the sound the cloth made as it ripped further, caught under the stick's bristles. It sounded like betrayal. You ungrateful child, her stepmother hissed. I told you, bleed it and it bleeds you back. Adiz stumbled. Her hands clutched the cloth, trying to hold it together. After 10 strokes, the woman stopped. Don't come inside until you've learned to respect what's been given. And she turned her back. Adiz stood in the rain long after it lost interest in falling. Her skin burned from welts. Her breath came in shallow sips. But what hurt most was the silence that followed. The part where no one came looking. No one asked. The cloth dangled around her like something dying. Later that night, after the house had quieted and she was allowed to crawl into her mat, Adiz examined the damage in the dark. The tear was deeper now. The cloth hung in two halves, barely joined at the top corner. It gaped when she moved. She couldn't risk another day like this. Another whipping. Another humiliation. She had no thread. No needle. But she had hair. It was already falling out from stress. Long, thin strands coiled around her fingers whenever she bathed. She gathered them now, from her mat, from her scarf, from the floor, and twisted them into something resembling thread. Then she searched for a thorn. There were always a few hidden in the straw by the back door. She found one, long, curved, dark at the tip. By firelight's memory, she pushed it through the edge of the cloth. It hurt more than she expected. Not the thorn in her finger, that pain she knew. But the act of stitching this thing herself. Mending what had been cursed from the start. Each pierce of the thorn brought blood. Just tiny pinpricks, but enough. She wet the hair to soften it, threaded it through the thorn's eye, and began. Push-pull. Thud. Push-pull. Not. The rip closed slowly but not neatly. It puckered. The hair curled and resisted. But she persisted, teeth clenched, legs crossed to steady herself. It took hours. She stitched until her fingers cramped and her eyes blurred. By dawn, the tear was no longer open. The cloth looked like it had been stitched by ghosts, uneven, angry, but it held. She pressed her forehead to the mended line and whispered, "Please." Not to her stepmother. Not to the cloth. But to herself. "Please last. Please hold. Please don't rip again." That day no one noticed. Or maybe they did and said nothing. The stitches were hidden under a fold and she moved carefully, never turning too fast. The cloth tugged differently now, tighter in some places, looser in others. It felt like it belonged to someone else. But Adiz had made it hers. With her pain. With her blood. With her hair. The broom never came that night. And as she drifted into sleep, she imagined the cloth speaking softly beneath her, a voice stitched in hair and thorns saying, "I remember now. I remember you." The night after she stitched the cloth shut with hair and thorn, Adiz fell into sleep so deep it felt like falling underwater. There was no pain there, no itching on her welts, no chill from the mended cloth clinging damp against her thigh. There was only blackness at first, warm, complete, until a low hum began to fill it. The hum grew into a wind, and the wind shaped itself into a woman. Not like the women in her village. This woman had skin that shimmered like woven silk and moved like fog. Her arms were long and smooth and her headscarf billowed without breeze. Her eyes were the color of moonlight over river water, shifting with every blink. She didn't speak, not with her mouth, but with a sound that moved through Adiz's ribs, like thread being pulled through skin. Adiz knelt without being told to. The woman reached into her chest, not with violence but with grace, and pulled out a needle. Silver, long, curved slightly like the crescent moon. No thread. Just the needle itself, glowing with the softness of thunderclouds. She placed it in Adiz's palm. And whispered one word into her ear. "Remember." Then she turned into wind again, dissolving into a swirl of storm-gray cloth and soft thunder. The dream folded inward and vanished. Adiz woke with her fingers clenched. She was certain it had been a dream. Just a dream. But when she sat up on her mat, she felt something cold press against her leg. She pushed aside the cloth, the real cloth, still frayed, still puckered with her hair-threaded stitches. And there, nestled into the torn seam she thought she'd closed, was the needle. Silver. Smooth. Slightly curved. Cold as moonlight. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. It was heavier than it looked, and warm almost immediately in her hand. She turned it over once, then twice. The tip was sharp but not cruel. She pricked her thumb lightly, just enough to feel it. And then she smiled. She did not ask how it had gotten there. Some things don't require explanation. They require reverence. She hid the needle under her mat during chores, afraid someone might find it and claim it. Or worse, throw it into the fire. But that night, after the lamps were dim and the house had settled into silence, she pulled out the cloth again. There were other small tears now. Time was always working. A split near the hip. A widening hole near the bottom edge. She threaded nothing through the needle, just held it between her fingers and placed it at the fabric's edge. It slid through like water. No effort. No resistance. And the moment it passed through the cloth, she heard something. A sound. Faint. Barely there. Like someone humming far off in the trees. A soft vibration traveled from the needle up her arm, into her shoulder and settled in her chest. She paused, heart thudding. She stitched again. Another hum. This time the thread formed itself, not from hair, not from string, but from the cloth itself. It curled out behind the needle, smooth and seamless, as if the cloth was mending itself under her guidance. She gasped but didn't stop. The hum deepened. It wasn't a tune she recognized, but it wasn't random either. There was rhythm, almost a song. Each pull of the needle brought another note, soft and steady, low and warm. The cloth beneath her glowed faintly. Not bright enough to light the room, but enough to see where the next tear lay. She stitched that too. And with it came another hum, this one sharper, more like a sigh. She worked until the cloth was whole again. No crooked seams. No puckering. No hair thread. Just a single piece of fabric humming faintly under her hands like a living thing. When she pressed it to her cheek, it purred. She slept with it wrapped around her like a second skin, warm and comforting for the first time in years. In the morning, the cloth didn't cling awkwardly. It moved with her. She could walk without holding it in place. She could kneel without it lifting. She didn't question it, just tucked the needle back under her mat and moved through the day with quiet steadiness. No one noticed the change at first. But the cloth no longer frayed. It no longer sagged or tore or caught on stray branches. Even when her stepmother shoved her toward the fire pit during chores, the cloth held strong. When her stepbrother threw a stone at her and it struck her hip, the fabric rippled, but didn't rip. Adise began to trust it. At night she stitched for no reason but the song. She would find tiny imaginary tears just to feel the hum in her hands, the comfort in her chest. Sometimes the melody changed. Sometimes it matched the rhythm of her breath. Other times it sounded like the voice from her dream, distant, gentle, instructive. Remember. She began to understand the cloth wasn't just something she wore anymore. It was something she shaped. Her stepmother began to grow suspicious. "Why do you walk like something owns you now?" she snapped one afternoon. "You think you're better because you've stopped tearing everything you touch?" Adise didn't answer. She didn't need to. The cloth had become her reply. One night, as she was stitching a spot that didn't exist, the hum changed. It grew louder, sharper, like a plucked string. The cloth shifted slightly, not away from her, but toward. As if it had something to say. She paused. Listen. The hum settled into silence. And in that silence, Adise felt her own voice return, not out loud, not in speech, but deep in her chest. It was the part of her that had hidden beneath the beatings, beneath the shame, beneath the cold mornings and trembling fingers. The part that had survived. The cloth pulsed once, warm. And Adise smiled. Not because someone told her to. Not because hunger demanded it. But because, finally, she understood. The cloth had been given as a curse. But she had stitched it into something else. Something hers. And with every stitch to come, she would write her story in thread and sound, until even the storms remembered her name. The cloth had been quiet for many nights. It no longer frayed. It no longer tore. Adise stitched it less frequently now, not because she feared it might break, but because it held itself together, steady as if it had learned her rhythm. Still, she kept the silver needle tucked under her mat, wrapped in dried leaves so her stepmother wouldn't find it. She never let it touch water. And she never spoke about it aloud. But one afternoon, as she crouched beneath the mango tree to wash her basin, the cloth caught on the edge of a stone. It was nothing dramatic. A small snag. A single thread pulled loose like a whisper. But Adise felt it immediately. The same way one feels when an old wound stirs. She froze, her hand still in the water. The cloth fluttered once. She pressed her palm over the tear and exhaled. It was not wide. Not deep. But it was enough. That night, after everyone had fallen asleep and the fire had reduced to embers, Adise unrolled the cloth carefully, laying it across her lap. She reached beneath her mat and retrieved the silver needle. As always, it was warm in her hand before she even touched the fabric. She lowered the tip to the torn edge and instinctively pricked her finger to test the thread. Just a pinprick. A bead of blood welled on her fingertip, small and red. But the moment it touched the thread that was forming behind the needle, something changed. The thread ignited. It did not burn, not with smoke or ash, but it glowed. Bright red, hot and pulsing. Like fire that had been waiting for air. It hissed as it passed through the fabric, and for a moment, Adise thought she might drop it. But the heat didn't burn her. It danced up her fingers like a ribbon of warmth, steady and controlled. The cloth pulsed beneath her once. Then again. Not in pain. In response. As if it was alive. As if it had felt her blood and said, "I see you." She stitched slowly, cautiously. The glowing thread faded as the rip closed, but the warmth stayed in her fingertips. When she knotted the final loop, the cloth shimmered under the moonlight leaking through the roof. She laid it across her shoulders and it wrapped itself gently, like arms around her. That night she didn't dream. But her body felt full, not with food, not with sorrow, but with something larger than breath. Something ancient. Something alert. The next morning she wore the cloth the same way she always had. No one noticed the change, not at first. But her stepmother eyed her longer than usual as she ground pepper by the hearth. "You've been quiet lately," the woman said. Adise kept her face still. Quiet girls are hiding things. Still no answer. The woman stood, walked to her, reached for the edge of the cloth at Adise's shoulder. "You've sewn it again." Her fingers pinched the fabric. Adise's heartbeat quickened. She didn't move, didn't breathe. The woman pulled, and the cloth moved. Not in the way fabric usually does, not with limpness or slack, but with resistance, like something bracing itself. The seam twisted under her fingers and slipped free. The woman yanked again, harder. The cloth didn't tear. It recoiled. It pulled away from her grasp with a sudden snap, twisting like a live fish escaping a net. The woman stumbled back, startled. Adise stared, wide-eyed. The cloth settled itself again, tight around Adise's body. Like armor. Her stepmother narrowed her eyes. "What magic are you keeping in that rag?" Adise shook her head, but her throat was dry. "Answer me." "It's just cloth," Adise whispered. But even she didn't believe that anymore. The woman lunged forward again, fingers grasping for the edge. The cloth flared. Just a flicker, but hot, and fast. The air shimmered with heat between them, and the woman gasped, pulling her hand back as if scorched. "You burned me." Adise stepped away, clutching the cloth to her chest. "I didn't." "You witch child." "No." The woman raised her hand but paused, uncertain now, eyes flicking between the cloth and Adise's face. "You think a rag will save you?" Adise didn't reply. But her fingers curled tighter around the fabric, and somewhere beneath her skin the warmth returned. The same humming heat that had filled her chest when the thread turned red. The cloth wasn't just defending her anymore. It was listening. Later that day word spread quietly. They said Adise had cursed the cloth. That it moved like it knew secrets. That it hissed when touched by anyone other than her. Some of the children wouldn't come near her. But some watched her with wonder. That night, Adise examined the cloth again. The seam she'd stitched with blood thread was warm to the touch. Not hot anymore, but not cold either. She ran her hand along it and felt it thrum once beneath her palm. The needle, still glowing faintly, rested beside her on the mat. She didn't sew that night. She didn't need to. The cloth was whole. But she held the needle anyway, listening to the silence. There was no song. No humming. Only her breath. Only the memory of fire where thread had once lived. And the pulse of something old, something loyal, wrapping itself around her body like a story she was just beginning to understand. Adise no longer feared the cloth. She no longer saw it as a burden or punishment but as something living, a part of her, yes, but more than that too. The days of hiding it under folds, of weeping when it tore, had passed like last season's dust. Now, every evening after the fire died low and the voices in the compound quieted, she brought out her needle and cloth like someone tending a sacred altar. And in that silence she stitched. At first, it was still the hum she knew, that quiet vibration that had begun the first time she sewed with the dream needle. But over the past few nights, something had changed. The hum was no longer just a sound. It began to split, to layer. Faintly, just beneath the rhythm, there were words. At first, she thought it was her mind playing tricks. She hadn't heard a real kindness spoken in weeks. She hadn't heard her name said with warmth in years. But as the thread passed again and again through the thickening cloth, she began to hear them clearly. Not her name, but others. Women's names. Names she didn't know, yet felt. A grandmother's name, maybe. A sister never born. A girl from another village, long buried but not forgotten. And not just names, prayers too. Snippets. Echoes. Phrases that came and went like breezes through old trees. Asterisk, may my cloth not shame me. Asterisk. Asterisk, keep me hidden when danger passes. Asterisk. Asterisk, let my body remain mine. Asterisk. They whispered from the hem as she sewed. Always soft. Always fleeting. And always only when her hands moved. The cloth grew. Not by much at first. Just a finger's length longer after a night of stitching. Then more. Each repaired edge seemed to pull new fabric from nowhere, weaving itself thicker, sturdier, more vibrant. The dull brown was slowly giving way to a deep red, like old earth or dried hibiscus. Faint patterns rose where there had once been plainness, symbols she didn't recognize, but which her fingers traced instinctively. By the seventh night, it nearly brushed her ankles. She didn't tell anyone. But others were beginning to notice. The neighbor's eldest daughter, who always pretended not to see her, paused one morning and stared too long. Her eyes followed the cloth, then darted away. A boy from the far compound tripped on his own feet while watching her fetch water. The baker's wife, who had once muttered, "Cursed child," when Adiz walked past, now blinked in confusion when their paths crossed. "You look taller," she murmured almost to herself. It wasn't just the cloth. It was Adiz. She walked differently now. Not with arrogance but with weight. As if her feet had learned to carry more than her own bones. Her spine had straightened. Her eyes no longer darted downward when spoken to. Even her silence had changed. It no longer meant fear. It meant listening. She was listening, always, especially to the hem. The cloth now sang and whispered at once. A layered sound, like rain tapping on many windows at once, some close, some far. And beneath it all, that ever-present rhythm. The pull, the stitch, the voice of thread and memory twining together. Her stepmother noticed too. She didn't say anything at first. But her eyes narrowed every time Adiz walked past. She began assigning her louder chores, pounding yam, hauling buckets, things that might tear the cloth or strain it. But the cloth held. Even when it snagged on wood or stone, it mended itself by dusk. Even when it stained, the marks faded by morning. It wasn't just enduring anymore. It was resisting. The whispers grew louder one evening when Adiz stitched along the bottom hem. She paused mid-seam, breath caught. The words were clearer than ever. Asterisk, you are the thread that remembers us. Asterisk, asterisk, sew us into the world again. Asterisk. She touched the cloth and felt it warm under her fingers. A wind passed through the room, though all doors were closed. Her needle vibrated in her hand. She didn't know who us was. But she nodded. And kept stitching. Soon the cloth reached her toes. Then pooled slightly on the ground. She began folding it upward, tying it to her waist, pretending nothing had changed. But it had. It grew thicker, heavier. Yet it didn't weigh her down. It gave back what it took. With every step she felt steadier, firmer, rooted. And the villagers, they whispered too now. She looks like her grandmother's ghost. Maybe she found something in the forest. No one stitched that. I saw the cloth breathing, I swear. Children peeked at her from behind fences. Women watched her pass and touched their own wrappers unconsciously. A few brave ones asked, "Where did you get that fabric?" Adiz only smiled, not coldly, not cruelly. Just enough to make them unsure whether they'd truly seen what they thought they'd seen. That night, as she stitched under moonlight, the cloth began whispering stories instead of names. Not full ones, just pieces. A girl who wrapped herself in palm fronds to escape a man who bought her. A woman who sewed her name into her waistband so no one could take it. A daughter who hid a message in the hem of her mother's burial cloth. I know who you were. These weren't dreams. They were rememberings. Adiz knew now that the cloth didn't just mend itself. It carried memory. It listened, learned, recorded. Each tear she stitched had once belonged to another girl. Somewhere, somewhen, and the act of repairing it brought that girl back for a moment. She wasn't sewing alone. She was weaving herself into a sisterhood no one had ever told her existed. The next day when her stepmother threw a cup at her, it missed. It hit the cloth instead and bounced off. No rip. No stain. The woman screamed, "What have you wrapped around yourself?" Adiz looked her in the eye. "Myself," she said simply, and walked away. That night, the whispers in the hem sang. Not just stories. Songs. Low chants with no words, just vowels stretched across the length of silence. The kind of sound that fills a chest, not just ears. She stitched to the rhythm, her silver needle glowing faintly with each pass. The cloth curled around her ankles now like fog. No one could ignore it anymore. The village began avoiding her. But not all in fear. Some out of awe. A few out of hunger, not for food but for the way she walked, the way her head never dipped, the way the cloth shimmered when touched by moonlight. One girl, no older than 7, followed her all the way to the stream. When Adiz turned, the girl whispered, "Can I touch it?" Adiz bent low. "Only if you listen." The girl placed her hand on the hem. Her eyes widened. "I hear someone crying." Adiz nodded. "That's how they begin." And the girl smiled. The cloth glowed. That night, Adiz added a new seam. Not to repair but to welcome. A prayer in thread. A space for more whispers. And as she sewed, the cloth stretched longer still. The sun had not yet risen when the first pot shattered. Adiz was already awake, folding her cloth slowly, listening to the morning wind. The cloth had grown heavier over the past week, but not burdensome. It draped across her shoulders like a mantle, and she wore it now not only as protection but as truth. It was no longer something she hid. It was the most honest thing she owned. The second pot shattered just outside the cooking area. Her stepmother's voice followed, sharp and shrill, barking accusations into the air like curses thrown at ghosts. "You let the yam rot, didn't you? You useless girl." Adiz didn't move. "Not yet. I saw you laughing yesterday. Who gave you permission to smile?" Still, Adiz stood in silence, adjusting the cloth at her waist, smoothing its corners. The red symbols embroidered into it, one she had not stitched but which had appeared anyway, seemed to glow faintly in the blue light of dawn. "You think this house owes you comfort? You think I owe you breath?" Then came the footsteps. Fast, angry, scraping against the dirt. Adiz stepped forward calmly just as her stepmother appeared in the doorway, face flushed and teeth clenched. "You ungrateful." And then it began. The blows. Hard, fast, desperate. Her stepmother struck with both hands, the side of a broom, the heel of her palm. She struck with the wildness of someone trying to erase something. She screamed, "Look down, and cry, you cursed thing." But Adiz did not cry. She did not flinch. The blows landed, but not as they once had. This time, the cloth rose before each strike, wrapping itself across her back, her shoulders, her arms. Not tightly, not strangling, just enough to absorb the violence like a sponge absorbing rain. Each slap echoed dully, the sound muted by fabric. And still Adiz did not blink. She stood, breathing slow and deep, eyes locked on the woman in front of her. The woman who had once made her afraid to breathe too loud. The woman who had once broken her wooden spoon across Adiz's ribs and forced her to eat standing, covered in bruises. The woman who was now panting. Slipping. "Why won't you cry?" she hissed. Adiz didn't answer. Her hands hung at her sides. Her face was calm. Not blank, but calm like river water that's seen too many stones fall into it to be disturbed again. The cloth rippled gently. Her stepmother's palm lifted once more, but this time she hesitated. Just for a moment. Long enough to see something shift behind Adiz's eyes. Not rage. Not defiance. Stillness. A knowing. It broke something in the woman's spine. Her arm dropped mid-swing. She took one step back. Then another. Adiz's eyes remained steady. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lift a finger. She didn't need to. The cloth moved for her. It unwound itself slightly, spreading at her sides like wings not yet unfurled. It shimmered in the morning light, its seams glowing with soft red threads. It pulsed once, visible, clear, and a gust of warm air moved through the room. The stepmother stumbled. She looked down at her own feet as if expecting them to betray her, then back up at Adiz. I should have cut that cloth when I had the chance," she muttered. Adiz tilted her head just a little. Her silence said everything. You tried. It didn't belong to you then. It never did. The woman backed out of the room entirely. She didn't scream again. She didn't throw another pot. She didn't come back that day. Later Adiz stepped outside. She washed her face in silence at the clay basin near the steps. Her reflection was different now. Her eyes were darker, not in color but in weight. As if they carried the memory of every night she had stitched herself back together. Behind her, the breeze lifted the edge of her cloth. It no longer brushed the ground, it dragged slightly, growing longer still. As if it too was done hiding. Children peeked at her from behind fences again. One girl whispered, "She doesn't cry." Another said, "She doesn't have to." In the evening she sat under the tree where she always sewed. She didn't need to mend anything, the cloth had no tears. But she pulled out her silver needle anyway. This time she didn't thread it with anything. She simply ran the tip along the hem, listening. The cloth whispered back. But not old names now. Not forgotten prayers. It whispered to her. You do not belong to pain. You are not stitched from fear. Your silence is not weakness. It is choice. And Adiz smiled. Softly. The kind of smile that's not for others, not even for show. Just for herself. The cloth pulsed warm beneath her fingertips. The sky turned gold, then blue. And the girl who didn't cry, didn't need to. Because nothing hurt the same when you finally remembered who you were. The drums began at dusk, steady and full of heat. Smoke curled from cooking fires, and the village air thickened with spice, sweat, and song. Laughter rose in pockets. Girls painted their faces with chalk and clay. Boys leapt and kicked beside fires. Even the trees leaned toward the sound, curious. It was festival night, the kind meant to cleanse the village of bad luck, to honor ancestors, to renew blessings. People wore their finest cloth. Bright greens, deep golds, shimmering blues. Heads wrapped high, hips tied firm. There was pride in every step. And Adi's stepmother had made her come. "You will go in what you always wear," she'd said that afternoon, voice sweet and cruel. "Let them see what you are." Adi's had said nothing. She had simply wrapped the cloth around herself again, the same one she'd worn for years. The one that had once hung limp and shameful over her skin. Now it moved differently. Still, she walked to the festival alone. Eyes followed her. The children giggled. A few women shook their heads. But something shifted as the moon rose. High, full, glowing clean in the dark sky. Its light caught on Adi's cloth, and it shimmered. Not brightly. Not enough to startle. Just enough to whisper to the air that something sacred had arrived. The other women's wrappers, so carefully ironed, began to wrinkle under the weight of the night wind. The hems curled. The folds lost their crispness. But Adi's cloth flowed like water. It did not cling. It did not crumple. It poured down her like a story with no end. She stood by the fireside as dancers whirled. She said nothing. She smiled at no one. And still, the cloth whispered with each of her breaths. The silver light in its seams pulsed softly. It glowed where the thread met hem. Patterns shimmered and shifted like living things. The women nearby shifted uneasily. Some stared too long, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. "That's the same rag she always wears," someone whispered. "But look at it. Is it silk?" "No, look again. Why does it look like it's breathing?" Her stepmother watched from a distance, face tightening. She had wanted Adi's to feel shame. To stand out like a scar among smooth skin. But instead, Adi's looked untouched by the dust of the world. Her head was high. Her arms loose at her sides. She didn't fidget, didn't lower her gaze. And the cloth, that cursed thing, made her look like someone meant to be remembered. A woman near the drum stepped forward. Her wrapper rustled as she approached. "What is that fabric?" she asked softly. Adi's met her eyes. "Mine." The woman stared a moment longer, then nodded once. "It suits you." And she walked away. Others tried not to look. But they did. They had to. Because Adi's stood like a pillar, and the cloth draped around her like moonlight turned soft. And the whispers it carried weren't just for Adi's anymore. Anyone standing close enough could almost hear them. Old names, lost songs, prayers folded into seams. One child stepped near her and reached out a hand. Adi's bent low, gently guiding the small fingers to the hem. The child gasped. "It sings." Adi's smiled. "Yes." The girl whispered something into the cloth. A name, maybe. A secret. And the fabric shimmered in reply. No one laughed at Adi's that night. No one dared. And when the drums slowed and the fires dimmed, the villagers parted for her as she walked home. Her stepmother did not meet her eyes. And the moon followed her all the way to the doorway, silver against silver, like kin returning to kin. The night after the festival was heavy with silence. Not emptiness, but a silence that breathed, thick with something unsaid. The drums had stopped. The fires had gone low. But the memory of that silver shimmer on her cloth lingered in the minds of all who had seen it. And in the heart of Adi's, it pulsed like a second heartbeat. She sat alone in the small hut, the silver needle cradled in her palm. The cloth lay across her lap, warm as always. The edges brushed the ground now, stretching longer than ever before. It had grown with her without her asking. It had taken her shame and stitched it into something else. But tonight felt different. The silence wasn't just around her. It was inside the cloth too. She listened. At first, there was only the wind beyond the mud walls, the creak of a door swinging gently in the breeze. Then, like a thread unraveling in reverse, a sound began to form. It didn't hum. It didn't whisper. It spoke. "You stitched me with pain," the cloth said, its voice soft and strange, not coming from the air, but from the threads themselves, the places where her hands had passed 1,000 times before. "I will carry you now." Adi's froze. Not out of fear, but awe. She placed her hand over the fabric, felt it pulse beneath her skin. You've always been alive," she whispered. "I've always been becoming," the cloth replied. She held her breath. Her fingers tightened around the silver needle. In the darkness of the hut, moonlight reached through the thatched roof and spilled across her lap. The cloth shimmered under it, glowing softly, not silver this time, but a red so deep it was nearly black. Like the last light before dawn. "I have nothing left to give you," she said quietly. "All my stitches are done." "Not all," the voice murmured. She paused. Then, as if pulled by memory, she reached under the mat. There, in a small wooden box no one else had touched in years, was her mother's old comb. It had once been full of thick, dark hair, but now held only a few strands caught in the teeth. Her mother had stopped combing her hair the day her father died. And Adiz had never asked her to start again. She lifted the comb gently. A single hair slipped loose. She threaded it. Not through cotton. Not through dyed string. But directly into the hem of the cloth, the final place where her own body had never added a stitch. The thread moved through with ease as if the cloth had been waiting. And as she pulled the needle through, the fabric exhaled. That was the only word for it, an exhale. A soft gust of breath that seemed to release something, not from the cloth but from Adiz herself. A weight she had not known she still carried left her shoulders, her ribs, her back. Her hands loosened. Her jaw unclenched. The cloth moved. Not fluttered. Moved. It lifted itself gently from her lap, coiling upward around her waist, her shoulders, her arms. It wrapped itself around her throat like a necklace. Across her chest like armor. It flowed behind her like a train she'd never worn but always deserved. And she stood. Not slowly. She rose the way roots rise when the storm is coming, with purpose. The cloth encased her like second skin, but not heavy. Never heavy. It was strong, silken, and almost impossibly warm. The red turned to silver, then to deep blue, then back to red again, changing with her breath. She stepped outside. The village was sleeping, but the night was wide awake. The moon looked down at her, full and clear, and the cloth shimmered in reply. As she walked, the ground seemed to soften beneath her feet. Every place where she had once been kicked, shoved, ignored, those paths now opened for her. Not because someone cleared them, but because the cloth remembered where it had been dragged and refused to be dragged again. It held her. It lifted her. At the compound where her stepmother slept, she paused. She didn't knock. She didn't need to. The cloth did it for her, a single ripple of wind pressing against the door. Her stepmother emerged, groggy and confused. She looked once at Adiz and took a step back. "What are you wearing?" Adiz didn't answer. She didn't need to. The woman's eyes darted to the cloth, and her knees buckled. "You brought shame into this house with that thing?" she whispered. "No," Adiz said softly. "You did." The cloth wrapped tighter, almost humming with agreement. "This," Adiz lifted one end of the fabric, "is what you gave me." Her stepmother's face twisted. "Rags? I gave you rags." "Yes," Adiz nodded. "And I made them remember me." The woman sank to the ground. Adiz turned. She did not stay to comfort her. She did not gloat. She walked. Toward the forest. Toward the place where the air was full of forgotten things and the moon was not ashamed to stare. She walked until the cloth stopped glowing. Until the night exhaled again. And there she sat beneath an udala tree and listened. The cloth was quiet now. Not because it had nothing to say, but because it had said enough. It had kept its promise. It would carry her now. Morning in the compound was slow and humming with tension. The sky hung low with gray clouds, and the chickens scratched cautiously at the dirt as if they too sensed what was coming. Adiz stood outside the hut, her cloth wrapped firmly around her. It draped over one shoulder and flowed behind her, gleaming faintly even without sun. Each movement she made seemed to breathe life into the fabric, as if it anticipated her thoughts before they formed. She didn't speak as she poured water into the clay basin to wash her hands. She didn't flinch when her stepmother's footsteps scraped across the courtyard behind her. She didn't even blink when she heard the rustle of cane dragged along the ground, dry, thin, cruel. "You think you're better now?" her stepmother spat. "You think this cloth makes you untouchable?" Adiz remained still, her fingers dripping water, her face calm. The older woman raised the cane. She gripped it with both hands the way she always had when she wanted it to hurt. Her arms lifted high, her anger foaming at the edges of her mouth. But this time the cloth moved before she could strike. It didn't wait for pain. It didn't allow the blow. Like a creature long fed but now wide awake, the cloth uncurled from Adiz's side and flew. It twisted through the air, wrapped itself tightly around the woman's raised arm, and yanked it back, sharp and fast. The cane froze midair. Then snapped in half. A hollow sound cracked across the compound, loud as thunder to those who knew what it meant. The cane fell in two pieces, one landing near Adiz's bare feet. Her stepmother gasped. The cloth hovered for a heartbeat longer, then fell, soft and quiet, curling again around Adi's frame as if nothing had happened. The woman clutched her elbow, wide-eyed, backing away. What are you?" she hissed. But before Adi's could speak they came. The neighbors. The cousins. The elders. Drawn by the sound, by the shift in air, by the presence of something they no longer understood but could no longer ignore. They formed a loose circle around the yard. No one said anything. They simply stared, at the cane, at the woman, and at Adi's. At the cloth that shimmered like water and moved like wind. Adi's turned. She didn't say a word to the crowd. She didn't need to. She stepped over the broken cane. The cloth followed, trailing gently behind her, glowing at its seams. She walked barefoot across the earth that had once burned her feet with shame. Now it seemed to part for her. Whispers rippled through the watchers. "Did you see?" She didn't touch her. No, the cloth, it protected her. Is that the same one from before? The rag? No. It's not the same anymore. She's not the same. Adi's didn't turn to acknowledge them. She walked slowly, deliberately, head high, shoulders loose, as if the sky itself had softened. Behind her, her stepmother slumped into the dirt, still clutching her arm, eyes wide and unblinking. The villagers didn't move to help her. They only watched the girl. The girl who had once worn shame. The girl who had once bled in silence. The girl who now walked untouched. And behind her, the cloth gleamed, not in gold or silver but in something far older, the quiet power of someone who no longer needed to be small. The hills remembered. Not in words, not in names, but in hums and rustles, in the way the wind moved through old trees and dry grass. They remembered the girl who once walked barefoot through shame, cloaked in cloth stitched with pain. Now the hills held her story like a secret worth keeping. Years had passed since the day Adi stepped over a broken cane and walked through her village without looking back. She had built no shrine, spoken no curse. But her presence had filled the silence people used to ignore. And slowly, others had begun to listen. They came in twos then tens. Girls with torn hems and bitten lips. Girls who whispered more with their eyes than with their mouths. Girls who had been left behind, beaten down, or told they were made for less. They came because they had heard. That there was a woman who wore her story and did not bow. That she lived near the hills in a house wrapped in fabric, where the trees bent low to shade the roof and the stones outside hummed at night. And Adiz welcomed them. She didn't ask them to speak right away. Some were too raw, too brittle. Instead she gave them needles, silver, bone, wooden, and placed cloth in their hands. Not new cloth. Old cloth. Faded, frayed, salvaged. Pieces from different lives. And she said only, "Stitch what you remember." At first the girls didn't know what that meant. They held the cloth like it might bite them. But slowly, thread by thread, memory by memory they began to stitch. Some started with tears. Others began in silence. A few pricked their fingers and bled into the seams. Adiz told them not to wipe it away. "No thread is wasted," she said. In the evenings she told her own story. Not in long speeches but in gestures. She'd lift her arm, show the hem where her mother's hair still lay woven. She'd let them touch the place where pain had once hummed but now pulsed with quiet pride. She wore her cloth like skin, loose and proud. Not like armor, not anymore. More like breath. Like a name that fit. Soon the girls began wearing their stories too. One wore a wrapper covered in red spirals, the dream she could never speak aloud to her father. Another wore stripes of blue, black, and green, the colors of the bruises her aunt had denied giving her. One girl stitched a single golden line down the center of her cloth and said nothing. But the cloth moved when she danced. They made a circle, these girls. Not of shame but of sound. Because when they sat together, needles moving, threads knotting, the cloths began to whisper. Softly at first, then louder. Not words exactly but songs. Fragments of rhythm, old lullabies, names buried deep in the earth. And at night, when the hills grew dark, the wind carried those songs. People in the village below heard them. They would pause mid-step, look up to the sky and feel something strange in their chests. Some said it was just the wind. Others swore it was cloth, old cloth, stitched with pain, stitched with power, singing itself back whole. People began bringing scraps to Adiz's home. Women too tired to speak brought wrappers worn through at the waist. Men who had daughters they didn't understand brought buttons and broken belts. And Adiz received them all. She taught without force. She listened without flinching. She sat with the ones who needed silence and with the ones who needed to scream. And she taught them to wear their stories, not to hide them, not to carry them in secret, but to stitch them into something that could never be torn again. So when the wind rushed through the hills, people knew. They knew it was not ghosts, not spirits, not warnings. It was memory. It was survival. It was girls who had been told to be quiet, now weaving noise, soft and strong, and never torn again.